Find out how my guest went from parking garage manager to Starfinder Design Lead.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Hey guys, welcome to the show. My name is Matt and I am your host. It is my pleasure to bring you a fascinating interview every Wednesday here on the DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. This is the show where we learn how to become better game masters and better role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. And today's episode, I talked to a game designer with an incredible story and career. You have got to stick around for this interview. My guest today is an Emmy award-winning game designer who has worked for companies from Wizards of the Coast to Paizo to Green Ronin and many more. Owen KC Stephens, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matt.
Before we get into your career as a game designer, could you just tell the listeners, when were you first introduced to tabletop role-playing games?
So I'm happy to, and amusingly, that links in directly to my first work as a game designer, although that work was terrible. In 1982, my parents took a trip to Europe and quite reasonably did not want to haul me and my sister along with them, so we were left for the summer with my aunt and uncle. And my uncle was a big geek and technology and fantasy aficionado, and he had a first edition hardback Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide that he had just recently gotten. And the cover looked fascinating, and I flipped it open, and it looked like a lot of fun, and so I asked him if we could play, and he said, well, I haven't figured out how to play that yet, so if you'll figure out how we play, I'll be happy to run a game for you. Well, of course, we didn't have a player's handbook, which is why we couldn't figure out how to play. But I figured out from looking at the Dungeon Master's Guide what information we needed for characters, even though I didn't know how you were supposed to make that information. So I wrote rules on how to have characters and make weapons and just based it on the lists of monsters that were in the DMG, the really short one-line descriptions of what a monster's stats looked like. So I was literally doing game design before I ever got to play a role-playing game. And that was terrible game design, but none of us knew that. And so we played a few times. My sister thought it was stupid. My uncle thought it was vaguely interesting not for him. And I was hooked on a lifelong hobby and career.
That's interesting that you said it was 1982. I first played Dungeons & Dragons in 1982 as well. So then where did you go from there? I take it you got a player's handbook at some point?
Yeah, so I pretty much pestered all of my relatives to get me all the role-playing game material that they could. So I got a player's handbook and a monster manual. But I did not have a lot of friends or children my age in my area, and I mostly spent time at home alone, and so the entire thing might have died on the vine there, if not for the fact that my mother was part of a college science fiction and fantasy fan group, and so she asked them about it, and one of them said, well, there's a similar game called Tunnels and Trolls, and they have solo adventures. So for several years, I was playing a lot more Tunnels and Trolls than D&D, and I ran through all the classic Tunnels and Trolls solo adventures, and I'm still a big fan of Tunnels and Trolls. Not necessarily as something I still play, but as something that very early on gave people that liked the idea of a role-playing game but did not have a group around them a way to play and interact with that game system. And then in time, when I moved on to my next school, got early in high school, got a regular playing group together. And some of those people are people I have now been playing role-playing games with for more than 35 years that I still see on a reasonably regular basis, although not as much since I left my hometown of Norman, Oklahoma. But we still get together a few times a year.
So after those experiences, you said you were hooked there from a young age. How did that lead you into a career of game design?
It was a combination of my wife being smarter than I am and poverty. I really, really wanted to get a subscription to Dragon magazine early on in my wife's and I's marriage, and the budget just did not have room for it. And I had been doing a lot of homebrewing. I wrote my own campaigns. I wrote my own magic items. I was literally rewriting every single spell in second edition. And I don't just mean in the player's handbook. I mean, we were scanning every second edition book we could find to get the text for me to rewrite them all to work with a spell point system I'd created for my home campaign. And we ended up creating a 500-page document that had all those rewritten spells. So my wife said, look, you like Dragon Magazine. I think a lot of your game material ideas are fun and interesting. All your friends think they're fun and interesting. Why don't you see if you can write an article for Dragon Magazine, and then we can use the money from that to buy a subscription. So literally, when I started my career, all I was trying to do is get enough money to get a subscription to Dragon Magazine. That was the height of my goal at the time. And so I wrote some pitches, and my wife typed them up because I wrote everything longhand at that point and could not type. And we sent them in a self-addressed stamped envelope to the address in Dragon Magazine. And then 6 weeks later, we got a response back from Dave Gross. And I had sent in 5 or 6 pitches, and there were 4 that I thought were really great ideas and one that I just threw in because I didn't want to waste the number of pitches I was allowed to send in. And Dave had no interest on everything I thought was genius. But the one thing I threw in just to fill my number of slots, which was a Dwarven name generator, he said, I can't use a Dwarven name generator. We just had our Dwarf article. But if you could do an Elven name generator in the next 30 days, that I could really use. So I spent a month hammering on a 1,000-word article, and that was about my writing rate at the time, 1,000 words a month, and sent it in, and it got accepted, and I got my check, and I bought my subscription to Dragon Magazine, and when it was accepted, Dave said, hey, here's the Dragon Magazine email address. Now that you're published, you don't have to send in a self-addressed stamped envelope anymore if you want to send in more ideas. And I did, and I told my wife how excited I was by that idea, and she said, great, I'm not going to type up any more of your articles. Here's some software to learn how to type. So she waited until not only was I hooked, not only had I successfully seen my name in print and bought a subscription based on my work, but that the publisher was encouraging me to try and do this more. And that was the beginning of my shifting from, at the time I was the manager of a parking garage at the University of Oklahoma, to being a full-time game designer.
An interesting transition there. So before you had wanted the subscription, you had not thought about game design, even though you were writing a 500-page document on AD&D spells?
I hadn't thought about it as a professional level. I had often wanted to be a fiction writer, and I had submitted short stories and tried to get into anthologies, and I had a subscription to Writer's Digest because that was literary, so my grandmother got it for me as a birthday gift one year. But no, until I submitted the article to Dragon Magazine, it had never occurred to me that there were such things as professional game designers. I knew it in theory, of course, but I assumed that there was some cabal of wise geeks that met in secret in some misty giant dice 6-sided castle in Lake Geneva and made all decisions. And I mean, I had met Steve Jackson. I owned Steve Jackson's early game design, Volume 1, I think, and I don't think there ever was a Volume 2. I was very excited about how game mechanics worked, but the idea of taking it as a career had just never occurred to me.
So where did writing these articles for Dragon Magazine, how long did that last, and then where did that take you?
So my first article was in issue 251, and I believe that was in 1996. It might have been late 96, early 97. And I started to get more and more articles, and some articles with other magazines, including I had one article that for quite a while, every time I sent it to a magazine, the magazine would accept it, they would schedule it for an issue, and then they would go bankrupt and start publishing just before the issue that's supposed to have my article would come out. And then I'd send it to a new magazine, and then it would die. Eventually, Pyramid actually published that magazine, so the curse was broken. But during that time, I was getting kind of excited that maybe I could be a professional game designer, but I had no idea how to make the leap from doing articles to doing larger, meatier projects. And my Dragon Magazine subscription noted that in 1997, there was going to be a TSR RPG Writers Workshop in Seattle. And I kind of sighed and noted that since we lived in Oklahoma and we were living on, my wife had a good full-time job with health insurance, which is frequently the case for freelance RPG writers. Their spouses often have good full-time jobs. But that there was obviously no way we could afford to send me to Seattle. And my wife sort of looked at this pile of magazine articles that I'd written and accepted for, and how much happier I was going to work sitting down and writing than I was when I was going and cleaning a parking garage. And she said, I think if we budget really, really, really carefully, we can do this. So again, if anyone has ever enjoyed anything I've ever written, I wrote it, but she's responsible for me starting on this whole career. So we skimped and we scraped, and we were literally doing things like, when we had game nights over at our house, we'd tell our friends, bring $5 and LJ will serve you a hot home-cooked meal. That's my wife, LJ. And then we'd eat the leftovers for a few days so that we didn't have to buy our own groceries, so that money could go towards sending me out to Seattle. In 1997, I went to the Seattle Writers Workshop from TSR. I got to meet a lot of the designers there. They gave us a lot of tips and input, and I wrote all that down. And then I wrote all of them a thank you note, because my father had given me a small, like 3x5-inch blue cloth-bound book called How to Get a Job that had no publisher or author listed. And one of the things that book said was, when you meet anyone in a professional capacity, if they are a speaker at a seminar or if they help you with an interview, send them a thank you note. So we wrote a physical thank you note to every one of the people that spoke at the Writers' Workshop. And several years later, I discovered that not only was I the only person at the seminar that sent people thank you notes, that for many of those professionals, it was the only thank you note they'd ever received in their professional careers. So in 2000, when Wizards of the Coast was hiring, because they were hiring up for what was later to be known as the D20 boom, I applied, and I didn't think there's any point in my applying. And again, my wife said, hey, look, if we could get this job, we would move out to Seattle. You would like this. This is exactly what you want. And even if they don't hire you, showing interest might mean that they would start giving you bigger freelance projects, because I'd, for several years at that point, just been doing magazine articles all the time. I did some other things. There were some online projects, and I wrote some reviews for alternative books, for example. But basically, it had all been magazine work. And so I applied early in 2000, and I am told that my application literally fell behind a filing cabinet, and so they didn't notice it at the time. And then a few months later, in early summer of 2000, they found it again, and they were doing another wave of hiring. So Mike Selinker called me and asked, hey, are you still interested in working for Wizards of the Coast? That led to a design test. That led to a phone interview. Then, because they were rich and fat on Pokemoney at the time from Pokemon, they actually flew me out for an in-person interview and put me up overnight. And then they offered me a job as one of the designers of the new D20 Star Wars Roleplaying Game.
I imagine you were a fan of Star Wars. How did that feel when you're offered a job working on a Star Wars role-playing game?
So I am a fan of Star Wars, but I was a much bigger fan of D&D than I was of Star Wars.
Okay.
So at the interview, they literally told me, what are you most interested in working on? Because we're going to have a D&D group, and we're going to have a Freeport group, a Forgotten Realms group, and we're going to have a generic D20 games group, and then we're going to have the Star Wars group. And I literally ranked Star Wars last. Not because I don't love Star Wars, but because everything else sounded more interesting to me. And so Thomas Reed called me right after that interview, and I was still at the hotel, and was like, so do you like Star Wars? And I'm not an idiot. Thomas Reed is going to be in charge of the Star Wars unit, so I'm not going to tell him, well, it's okay. So yeah, I told him I am a big fan of Star Wars in general, but I am not, for example, I hadn't played the D6 West End Games version. I had not read a ton of the novels and a lot of the comics. So I told them, I know my Sith from my Jedi, but I'm not an expert. But I'm a fast learner, and I am excited to do that if that is the opportunity that comes along. So the real moment for me was after I was out there in Seattle, where at one point I discovered that I was supposed to write up stats for Emperor Palpatine. And that was the moment where sort of the geeky side of me was like, oh my God, we're going to define Emperor Palpatine. Mm-hmm. Also at that point, the Star Wars Gamer magazine was just being started by Wizards of the Coast. And at one point, Dave Gross came down and he said, look, I just got all this cool art, which, by the way, was from Jeff Carlisle, who I did not know at the time because this was early work of his. I got all this art of Star Wars-like starships. I want to put them in the magazine, but someone needs to write a bunch of write-ups of what these starships are within the Star Wars universe. Can you do that? And I was like, this is the sort of thing I do for fun as a hobby, right? If I find a cool picture of a Star Wars-like starship online, I will write what is essentially fan fiction of how that fits into the Star Wars universe, so I can use it for my own games. Because again, I was running a lot of my homebrew stuff at that point. So I told him I was really excited to get to do that, and then he told me, "Sure, I'll write up a contract." And I realized I was going to get paid for extra work for writing this article that was going to do this thing that I was just excited to get to do. So the fact that I wrote things that entered into the Star Wars universe and have since shown up outside of the RPG. There's the ILH KK class Citadel cruiser, which has shown up in some of the computer games and some of the card games. I mentioned the Killian Rangers, which were a non-Jedi group of Force users, and one of them showed up in a quote in the Darth Vader novel that came out a few years ago. So it was kind of later that I really started to geek out to realize that I'm not just translating things that exist into game stats, but I'm adding things that are then in very small ways becoming parts of the larger Star Wars universe. And that's sort of the cool thing.
Now, the West End Star Wars game system, I played the heck out of that thing. And that was incredible. But just kind of thinking about that people have used some of the material you created outside of RPGs in other properties related to Star Wars. I think that is pretty cool, man.
It's kind of a trip. It really is.
Now you began working on Star Wars there at Wizards of the Coast. Maybe how long did that last? And then where did you go next?
That lasted 14 months almost to the day, because having had 3 rounds of hiring, my first day was June 2000. Then the first round of layoffs hit August 2000.
Oh, gosh.
And I survived that round. Then there was another round of layoffs in December of 2000, and I survived that round. And then there was another round of layoffs in June of 2001, and my job got cut, but I had just started working on the Power of the Jedi source book. So they said, so we're going to lay you off, but we want you to stay until August. And I'd been hoping, I would find some other position I could transfer over to at Wizards of the Coast. So I said, sure, absolutely. But I didn't. So in August, my wife and I sat down and we were like, well, Seattle's a pretty expensive city. We were here for this job. This job is now gone. We can either fight tooth and nail. And literally 2 weeks before I got laid off, we sold our house in Norman and bought a house in Covington out near Seattle. And so I got laid off right after we had given up having a home back home in Norman. And that was just a few months after I said, hey, is my job secure? Can I afford to sell my house? And I was assured at the time, yes, no, we've done all the layoffs we're going to do. But with any corporation, the people you talk to, right, your manager, you're the vice president of your department, they are not the only people making decisions. And so they kept changing what their business plan was. So they told me my job was secure because they were told at the time, we're not going to do freelance anymore. Everything will be done in-house. So they knew what they had to have in the way of staffing. Mm-hmm. And they liked the work I was doing. So there was no chance they were going to get rid of me. But then they decided at a higher level, okay, we're going to do a whole lot of this freelance because it's cheaper. And literally said, put everyone in your department in order from most to least important. And then after you give us that order, we'll tell you how many of them from the bottom we're cutting. So we moved back home to Norman because it was cheaper, and because my family literally had a spare house at that point, was sitting empty, and they're like, so you can live here for free if you want for a year or two. And that just seemed like too good a deal to pass up, having just lost my job. But that was during the D20 boom. The 3rd edition D&D had come out, Star Wars D20 was out, Call of Cthulhu D20 was out. And so being someone who had been a playtester for 3rd edition and had credits for the Wheel of Time D20 role-playing game and a whole bunch of Star Wars role-playing game things, I was suddenly in demand as a freelancer by a lot of companies. So I was immediately contacted by Sword and Sorcery, which was a division of White Wolf, and they wanted to do a bunch of D20 material, including the EverQuest D20 tabletop role-playing game. And they took a bunch of us out to lunch at that Gen Con in 2001 and signed us up. So I did a lot of EverQuest work for them. And there were new magazines opening up, like D20 Weekly, which isn't around anymore, but that was Steve Jackson. And the people that were pinged to be managers for it were people I had known from Wizards of the Coast who had gotten laid off. So they got me work. There was a lot of online work available from Wizards of the Coast because most of their designers didn't have time anymore. And the people they knew they could trust to write good freelance material were people that had worked there but gotten laid off. And then I started getting work from companies like Green Ronin, which was Chris Pramus, who I had gotten to know at Wizards of the Coast. And his company predates the D20 boom, but he took advantage of it and started making a lot of game lines. And I was doing a lot of 3rd edition and 3.5 work for him, including I wrote the Advanced Game Mastering Manual, and I wrote still one of my favorite projects, a race book called Bastards and Bloodlines, which is a book about half-breeds. And so that just took off. And so I was simply freelancing magazines and big company projects kind of nonstop while living in Norman and letting my wife finish her college degree and paying for, we finally eventually bought a new house, etc.
I mean, that's a lot of titles and a lot of information there. Now, how long did you stay then a freelance? Or did you go back to a company?
I full-time freelanced from 2001 until 2014. During that time, I had done a lot of magazine work for Paizo Publishing, who had taken over Dragon and Dungeon magazine. And then they lost the magazine license and started working on Pathfinder, their own role-playing game. And since I'd worked with them a lot on the magazine, I just transitioned over to writing Pathfinder material for them. So I wrote the Guide to Absalom, for example. And I worked on the Advanced Player's Guide and a lot of the player companion books. And every few years, they would have a job opening and I would apply for it. And every few years they would contact me and say, hey, we love your work. We still want to work with you, but you just weren't the best match for this job for whatever reason. And sometimes it's because they were trying to hire someone with less experience because I had wage requirements. Sometimes it's because they found someone local because they didn't want to pay to move someone out. But in 2014, I applied for a job at Paizo and actually got it that time. So my wife and I packed everything up and sold our house and flew out to Seattle. And so I worked for them from 2014 until July of this year.
And so what did you do for Paizo?
I was hired specifically to work on the Pathfinder modules line as a developer. I developed a single module, Plunder and Peril. And then Patrick Rennie, who was one of the people that helped train me there, moved on to work at DigiPen. So he had been doing the player companion line. And I had helped him with some that were behind schedule. And then when he left, I liked doing the player companions more than I liked doing modules. And to be honest, Paizo liked the quality of work I was producing with player companions more than they liked the quality of work I was producing with modules. And that's largely because they were module experts, right? And I would have gotten there. In fact, I'm probably there now, but I wasn't when they hired me, and they knew that. But they had to have someone at the player companions, and that was a line that I was already sort of showing expertise at. So I stayed on that for a couple of years, and then they decided to do Starfinder. And of course, we knew that one of the reasons we were doing Starfinder is that the second edition Pathfinder was being worked on, and the Pathfinder design team needed time to work on it. So we needed a product that wasn't 100% them, that was still going to be a big hardback. But also, we decided it was time to branch out from the line, that we'd done everything with Pathfinder, and that had done well, but it is worth looking at different IPs and different game spaces and getting different players. So originally, James Sutter and Rob McCreary were putting together just the very early documents on Starfinder. And since I had worked on the D20 Star Wars Roleplaying Game and Pathfinder, and by that point, the Black Company D20 game and Wheel of Time D20 game and Gamma World D20, I had a lot of science fiction and fantasy experience in D20, so I was the next person they brought on that project. So there was some overlap, but I transferred from the player companion line and did Starfinder full-time. And Rob McCurry and I are listed as design leads in the core rulebook, and then I was the Starfinder design lead from the core rulebook through the character operations manual, which was the last thing I did before I left.
And so what are you doing currently then? You said you left.
Yes, I left my job. My wife got a job offer in Evansville, Indiana. We decided that job offer was good enough to move for, so we moved. And unfortunately, that didn't work out. So she and I are now both full-time freelancers. So I'm back to full-time freelancing, though when I had free time, Green Ronin also came by, and I had been working for them for a while on the Freeport line for Pathfinder while I was at Paizo, in fact. And they asked me if I wanted to be the developer for Fantasy Age, because Jack, the Fantasy Age developer, was looking to take a break from doing that. So that's the other thing I'm doing now. I'm in my second month of being the Fantasy Age developer, and I'm sure we will have more announcements about what I'm doing with Fantasy Age in a bit. Luckily, Jack had a line of products several months in advance taken care of, so I've got time to get used to it and pitch some things and get things outlined. But announcements should be coming before too long. I own, with my wife and our friend Stan, Rogue Genius Games, who've been doing a lot of Rogue Genius works. I'm freelancing for Paizo again and several other companies. And then later this week, we're going to be announcing a great big project called 52 and 52, where we are going to be taking pre-orders, where people will get to buy a project, where they will get a product a week, every week, for the year of 2020. So starting in the first week of 2020, we'll send you your first product, and you'll get a new one every single week for the whole year. And I will write or develop those. And all of those products will be released for Pathfinder First Edition and Pathfinder Second Edition and Starfinder and Fifth Edition. So if you enjoy anything in that line of games, you'll get all 4 versions for one pre-order price, and that'll be on the Open Gaming Store. And it hasn't actually gone live yet, but I presume it will very, very soon this week.
It seems like you're very busy.
Well, I mean, when you're a game designer, if you're not working for a game company on salary, you're literally working for a certain number of cents a word normally. So that requires you to be busy and hopefully live someplace reasonably cheap if you're going to make a living doing it. Or the alternative is to have a spouse that has a good enough job that you don't have to be pulling half the weight of paying the bills.
I just find it fascinating, being able to talk to you because, I self-publish tabletop RPG resources, and I basically know nothing about the industry. Since anybody now can self-publish,
Yeah.
I basically know nothing about the industry. So it is fascinating to hear you talk about this. What would you say to somebody who's looking to work in the industry? Like, how would you get your first job or something like that?
Well, I've got a blog, OwenKCStephens.com, and I've literally got a lot of tips in there on how to get your first job, et cetera, et cetera. And I have to warn people in advance. I've been doing this for more than 20 years now, and the industry has changed since I broke in. When I broke in, there was this very clear path that you would write for some online projects. For example, I was literally doing reviews for America Online's TSR forum. That's one of the ways I got my name out in front of TSR. That's not an option anymore. And I wrote for the big magazines of the day, and most of them aren't around anymore. Now, some still are. There's Pyramid Magazine. And so if you have any interest in GURPS-related things or sort of generic game tools and hints, that's the sort of thing that Pyramid will publish. Other than that, there are a lot more small publishers now than there used to be. I mean, I run Rogue Genius Games. We do new people all the time. There's Wright Publishing. I'm a producer for them, so I help put together projects of theirs. There's Legendary Games. There's just a whole bunch of small publishers. There's Everybody Games. So I would literally recommend go to DriveThruRPG, click on your favorite game system, and see if there are smaller third-party publishers publishing things for that game. And if there are, contact them and see if they need work. Also, as you say, the barrier for publishing is much lower than it used to be. So I recommend, if you don't have any other gig, start writing game material on your own blog, on social media posts, places where you control it being distributed. Because if anyone's going to make money on your work, you should be one of them. But there is value to getting your name out there. So I think there is a legitimate work for exposure mechanism. I just think you need to make sure that when you're working for exposure, it's not someone else gets paid and you don't.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. In technology these days, self-publishing is so. I mean, it's just within the grasp of almost anybody that you can do. I mean, of course, I get a lot of questions now about since I self-publish. The real trick, of course, is writing something is difficult. Self-publishing is actually really easy, and then but the hardest thing is marketing it, because there's so much stuff out there. And I try to tell people that writing, layout, design, art, uploading it to platforms, all that's 20% of the work, and then 80% is marketing.
And that's another reason why I think it's useful, if you're trying to build your own career, to start building a presence on social media in your own blog, right? Mm-hmm. I am active on Facebook and Twitter in part because that means if I say, hey, folks, I've got a new product out, I have a following there where they're, I'm giving them funny tweets and keeping them appraised of my opinion of what's going on in the industry, and just posting cartoon prompts and writing prompts and my typo of the day, whatever it is. That's content that is quick and easy for me to produce, that keeps people watching my social media presence. And that means they pay attention when I then say, hey, look, I've got this 52 and 52 pre-order, or hey, Rogue Genius has this new product that's out. Mailing lists can also be important, although building them and caring for them is a lot of work. One of the things I think someone has to ask themselves pretty early in their career is, do I want to be a writer or do I want to be a publisher? Because being a publisher is a whole lot of work that isn't writing. And if you're going to be good at it, you'll end up spending less time writing than you are doing everything else. And that's part of what you were just talking about. So even if you self-publish a few things, hopefully that means that you will get your foot in the door. And if what you want to be is a writer, or if what you want to be is an artist, or what you want to be is a graphic designer for games, do a few things, but then look at, hey, do I want to work with someone else, or do I want to partner with someone? There are more and more small companies that are now partnering together. Like Rogue Genius Games is the publisher for Everybody Games. So Alex Agunas, who owns Everybody Games, he puts all his products together. He owns them. He decides what he's going to price them at. He decides when he's doing his own sales. But when he's got those products ready, he gives them to us, and we put them up for sale, and we advertise them. So he gets the benefit of our multi-years of building marketing venues and having mailing lists and being a known presence. And we get the benefit of a tiny cut of his sales, but also more products are going up more often, which is more opportunities for us to point people at our entire catalog.
Yeah, that sounds like a great arrangement there. And I think that is good advice for, people who are looking to get into the industry. I think too, you mentioned mailing list. You can't really discount the quality of a good email list if people are wondering, about building their audience. That is definitely a key for me as well as I started self-publishing. But there is one thing though. Even just when I look around at some of the small companies, to me, it is hard to find any that are accepting submissions. I see submission pages on a lot of them, and then you go there and they say, well, I'm not accepting submissions anymore. And I don't know if that is just a problem of knowing those people and just reaching out to them kind of personally or something. I don't know what your take is on that.
Well, I think you have to be persistent. Publishers get busy, right? So even if they are taking submissions at a given moment, that doesn't mean they're not later. The other thing is it can be very, very useful to say to them, hey, I have written an entire 3,000-word manuscript that is designed to fit into your all's Books of the Arcane line, and I've published these other works. And when you do that, you may be able to cut through, hey, we're not taking blind submissions, because you tell them the work is done. They can go look up other work you have done. That's one of the advantages of self-publishing or having your own blog. And it shows them that you have paid attention to the kinds of things they publish, right? If someone pings me and they just say, are you taking submissions? Sometimes if I say yes, they send me their poetry. And I don't have a problem with poetry, but Rogue Genius has never published a single piece of poetry in our history. So when you do that, you are telling me you have spent no time looking at my company and determining is what you're doing a good match for us. Whereas if you say, hey, I noticed you had a big long line of bullet point products that are 1 or 2 pages. I've written 5 or 6 in the game systems you all work on. Are you interested in seeing those and seeing if something you want to publish? That is even an initial contact. Gives me an opportunity to say, oh, this is someone who's paying attention. This is someone who has something I might be able to use immediately. The other advantage you said is getting to know people. Social media can be good for that as well. I wish I could say that absolutely everyone that contacts me gets exactly the same fair shake based on nothing but the content of that email. But the fact of the matter is, if I know your name because you write LOL on my social media posts on a regular basis, just subconsciously, if nothing else, I'm going to think, oh, this is a person that has put their name in front of me in a positive light more than once. I am more likely to think, well, this is a fan of mine and it's a friend of the company and he's obviously paying attention. So that's someone that I should consider giving some time to, even if I don't have a lot of time for a big slush pile.
Just recently, a professor here at a local university in St. Louis had me come and speak to his class, and they have a full game design major now with classes, and just kind of blew my mind. And just talking with him and talking with some of the students, and I was trying to tell them some of these things because I know they're going to have, you just don't know, in the position of those students, they just don't know exactly yet what they need to do when they come out of school and are looking for a job. And so I was trying to tell them some of these things. So I'm glad that you're saying some of these things. So, because I know some people who are listening are looking to get into the industry.
Well, and I think a lot of this stuff applies to any game job you're trying to get, right? Like I do not myself work in the video game industry. Mm-hmm. I have done some text stuff for it, but that's it, freelance. But one of the things I talk to the people that I know who do work in the industry is that at this point, if you want to be in the video game industry as a writer or as a narrative writer or any of that, you probably need to have designed some levels using some of the software out there to design levels, to present text games, to have something short and finished, so that if you say, hey, I would very much like to work for this video game company, I have this work I can show you if you're interested in seeing samples, because no one wants to take the time and risk to bring on someone that is totally unproven, someone that has absolutely no experience and nothing they can point to say, I did this thing.
Yeah, and as we've been saying in this day and age, since you can do things like that through the internet, through software available, and self-publishing is accessible, that there's really no reason not to do some of those things, because you are just going to prove to companies that you are looking at that you have initiative, you have drive, and you have creativity, and you can finish some things and put it out there.
Yeah, I mean, a degree is nice, and I'm like you, I'm a little shocked. I mean, there are, like, DigiPen is an entire system designed to help people become game industry professionals. That was when I was trying to become a game industry professional. The best I could do were things like the TSR Writers Workshop, which was great, don't get me wrong, but it happened exactly once, and I had to fly across the country to it. And some creative writing classes and going to seminars at local conventions. That was it. That was the educational opportunity I had. But I think, as with anything, having a degree is sort of a starting point, and it gives you some basic skills. Having something where you can say, I finished this thing, no matter what it is. I didn't just start it. I don't just have ideas. I have the necessary focus to finish some game-related product. Puts you a level ahead of people who just say, hey, I've got a piece of paper that says I have the skills you're looking for.
So now we've talked about your career and we've talked about the industry some. A lot of the people who are listening to the podcast run games all the time. So kind of one of my favorite questions to ask, if you're running a game, what does your game master prep look like? Do you write everything or do you improvise things?
I like to have an outline written. And it tends to actually look a lot like a product outline now, because I've been doing this for the game industry for 20 years. Okay. I don't want to have to write everything down, but for example, if you are going to a place where I know there are supposed to be cyber ninja alligators, I don't want to have to make up cyber ninja alligators on the flies, right? I want to have, here are some cyber ninja alligator stats, here are some appropriate names, here are some of their tactics, maybe come up with a few ideas for encounters. But then I have that as a very loose file, so that if what happens is the players go, oh, we're not going to go into the swamp of cyber ninja alligators, that is obviously where they'll have all their traps. We will instead airdrop in from above directly to the compound we're trying to get to. I won't have spent a lot of time writing out cyber ninja swamp encounters that now are going to be bypassed. And I don't have the temptation to say, well, you guys can do that, but there's going to be a wind mishap, and I guarantee you're going to end up in the swamp, because that's where I've done all my prep work. I can just, but you got to be, no prep is wasted, in my opinion. And I actually have a story I tell about that. One of my friends, Carl, who's one of the people I've been gaming with for more than 30 years, he takes better notes than I do. He takes much better notes than I do. That's great when he's the GM, but when he's a player, if we have a campaign that runs months or years, he sometimes has notes about things I didn't make a note about and have totally forgotten. And so in a relatively famous case, we're playing a D&D game, and I had come up with the idea of the Waters of Life were going to be one of the important things in my campaign. And on like the third or fourth session, I gave one of the player characters, who was a druid, a vial of the Waters of Life, and they were supposed to guard it and only use it if it was important. And then I flat forgot I did that. I totally forgot. I didn't make a note. It didn't come up again. We ran that campaign for a decade, a real world 10 years. So 10 years later, I've decided, hey, I finally need to do something with the Waters of Life, and I write up a dungeon that is going to guard the Waters of Life, and it's the last place where you can get the Waters of Life. When the players were trying to talk to an old Mother Superior nun, they weren't being allowed to, because she was near death, and the strain of answering these difficult questions might kill her, and the nuns weren't going to let them see her unless they brought a vial of the Waters of Life, so she would be at her full health. I had a huge adventure plan with a dungeon, with levels, with an overland trek, etc. And Carl just looked through his notes and he said, great, I'll be right back. And he walks outside to where the other player character is. And he's like, hey, do you still have those Waters of Life that you picked up on this game session in the 1990s? And they were like, what are you talking about? But they looked at their character sheet and they had dutifully written Waters of Life every time they'd gone up a level, over 15 levels of gameplay. They're like, it's still written here. I've still got it. And it's like, okay, according to my notes, Owen, you gave them Waters of Life on this date for this reason. They were told to only use it if it was important. This seems important. And the other player was like, no, you're right. This seems important. Here you go. So it was this epic thing that was supposed to be impossible. And Carl's character goes out and takes 10 minutes to do it, comes back, and he's like, okay, can I see the Mother Superior now? And they're like, ooh, of course you can. You can do this impossible thing in 10 minutes. Just let us go get her a drink. I had this huge dungeon. I could have said the Waters of Life don't do it, or those Waters of Life have gone bad, but I don't want to take anything away from the players when they're clever. So no, not only have you done it, but these very suspicious nuns and even the Mother Superior are very impressed with your abilities now. And so they asked the Mother Superior, okay, how are we going to defeat this villain, which is what they wanted to talk to her about. But this is why no prep ever goes wasted. What they learned was the secret to defeating this villain is a weapon, which is at the bottom of this dungeon after this overland trek. I just take all that preparation I did and I change it from the thing I thought they were going to get to the next step of the adventure. Okay, now this is the ultimate goal instead of a midway goal. And so I still get to run that dungeon for everyone, but they get the benefit of having successfully been smarter and cleverer and better note takers than I am. I never want to take away from the victory of the players as a GM. I want to help create the most awesome story and sense of having fun I can. And as a player, I don't like it when I come up with a neat idea and the player just shuts it down. So I don't want to do that as a GM either.
I find it kind of interesting how you say no prep goes to waste because, and I see what you did there, and I think that is perfect by switching out the goal of that dungeon to another item and then just reusing the prep. I think that's great. But I have had sessions where I have prepared things and oh boy, does it get wasted. Because, well, number one, say I prep something and then the campaign, everybody cancels and we don't run anything. The campaign falls apart. The group falls apart. Or I know one example that I kind of give is that I created 12 star systems with multiple planets for a Star Wars game. And my players went to 2 planets, not 2 star systems. They went to 2 planets. And so I had all of these, 11 star systems plus other planets in the 1 star system they were in. And we never even got to touch any of that stuff. And so kind of my solution with that, I talk about that in my book called The No Prep Game Master, but my solution to that is I publish that stuff.
Sure. Well, and that's a case of it not going to waste, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting when you say, it doesn't go to waste, but it just does seem like there could be some cases where it still does go to waste. But I guess what I kind of work from is I've just seen in myself sometimes and in other game masters kind of this weariness of like, okay, I created this and you want to rob a bank? Is that what are you just telling me you want to rob a bank? And I created this epic, adventure or something. And kind of with my thinking, I'm just trying to make sure that the game masters don't want to, strangle their friends that they've known for 30 years or whatever.
I think every game master needs to find a balance of things that works for them. And I think you got to find a balance of things that works for the specific group. I have what I have long called the ninja principle, which is that anytime I am running a campaign and it's run a few sessions and it looks like it's going to keep going, I want to introduce into that campaign a group of foes that are known, that are feared, that are specifically stealthy, and that can be paid to attack you. And it doesn't have to be ninjas, right? It can be teleporting shadow priests. It can be cyber hackers, right? Anything that fits all of those criteria, so that if the players ever take me completely and totally and utterly by surprise, and I have absolutely nothing ready for what they want to do, I can attack them with whatever that campaign's ninjas are. I've got them written up, I drop those on them, and everyone goes, oh, yeah, we have pissed some people off recently, haven't we? Okay, I understand why they're trying to shut us down. Or, hey, who have we pissed off recently that would try and shut us down? But it's been established in advance that these are a threat that are around that you have to deal with.
That's brilliant, actually. That is a brilliant idea. And now just kind of even thinking about that, I've done things like that in the past, but probably not with as much forethought as you just explained. But there was a Star Wars campaign where my players went kind of off the rails, and I introduced something similar to the Reavers from Firefly, because I just had them attack their ship, and next thing you know, we're fighting, space zombies or whatever, and the players had a blast. But I had nothing. They were going somewhere where I just had nothing ready for them or anything like that.
And sometimes, rather than them being people that can be hired, I establish them as people that have a specific bone to pick with the player characters. I ran a Star Wars game where one of the players wanted to be a Jedi, but really, really wanted to have a red lightsaber. Fine, I don't want to take away their fun. You're a Jedi, you ended up with a red lightsaber. But I then established that there was a group of Force mystics who desperately want to get a hold of this Jedi and her lightsaber, because they're trying to figure out how did a Jedi end up with a red lightsaber while using the normal Jedi process. And if we can't get it directly from her, then we will have to grab or kidnap her friends to force her to come deal with us. And so those became the ninja in this game. They're Force mystics. They can wave their hands and say that you did, this is nothing unusual. You didn't notice this coming, so I can have them attack from anywhere. And the players knew no matter what you're doing, there's an entire order out there, mysterious and shadowy, who specifically want to get this character, and she doesn't want them to have her or her stuff for scientific experimentation. And again, it just meant anytime, like you said, they went someplace where I was completely not prepared, you get halfway there, and then when you're refueling, you get attacked by shadow mystics.
That's fascinating because, yeah, like I said, I published a book called The No Prep Game Master. So I've kind of in recent years just gone to where I will just not hardly plan anything, just usually some ideas that I have in my mind. I won't write down anything. And then while I'm at the table, I will allow dice to tell the story. I will ask my players questions, and then I will roll dice, and that will just determine what's going to happen based on just ideas I'm having at the table or ideas that they are having at the table, and just allow dice to tell the story. I find that works better for me now that I'm married. I have 3 boys and things like this, where when I was younger, I could spend a couple nights preparing some things or writing out some things. But now, if I have 3 hours to role play, that's the only 3 hours I have other than thinking about it in the shower or something like that.
I frequently find that if you need non-game issues to be dealt with, sometimes the way to deal with that is to handle them outside the game. For example, I was playing with a group where the GM said, look, I'm going to run you all through an adventure path from Paizo. It's for Pathfinder. I don't have time to prep anything that isn't in this adventure path. So if you all go herring off the rails of this adventure, I'm going to just blatantly tell you, okay, guys, the adventure path doesn't cover that, so I'd like to ask you to take one of these other choices instead so we can play. And we're all adults, right? So we just said, okay, this is the activity we're playing. When you're playing Monopoly, no one complains, hey, I wanted to turn left there. Well, no, this is all right turns. There's only right turns in this Monopoly game. So by the GM being up front and saying, I'm fine with you all being creative, but if you do something that this set of books gives me no guidance on, I'm just going to ask you to go a different route. It's not you did anything wrong. It's just that I don't want to waste time hemming and hawing and trying to force you back on the train tracks. This one is a train trip.
I think it's always important just to talk to your players and to understand what kind of game you're playing. And, I just released a big campaign that I had been running for a while for free on Drive-Thru-RPG called The King's Road. And when we started that, I basically told my guys, I was like, okay, look, you know how I play. I do allow the players a lot of freedom, but for this one, you just have to follow this road. There's a big stone road, and they're given an object, and they have to travel to the end of this road. And I'm just like, you can do whatever you want as long as you keep traveling along this road.
Right.
And because that's the concept of the game. That's just the concept of the game. So, and that hasn't hindered them. They do all kinds of crazy stuff. They've taken out, an orc lair and all kinds of fun, really cool stuff. And they, starting to deal with some politics in some areas, like dealing with some deserters from this Duke's troops and all kinds of stuff. So they're doing all this stuff, but they just know they have to follow the road. They just have to follow the road.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the way that you can avoid a lot of the classic long-term problems. I think there was a point in time, and I don't want to point fingers at any specific group or trend, but it felt like there was a while where there was this sense amongst some players that if I am role-playing and I am my character and I'm in this world, then I should have the right to make any decision I can conceive of, and everyone has to cope with that decision no matter what it is. And it is true that there is no rule in the game preventing that, but there is a social contract that you are here to play an activity with these people. Just like if we were playing Monopoly, there may be no rule that says you are not allowed to take 5 hours to decide whether or not you are going to buy a property before you put it up for auction. But there's a social contract that you just don't take that kind of time to make your turn. So I think it's worth us all remembering that role-playing games are still games, and hopefully we're getting together because we all want to have fun.
I've even a few times have told a player, the player will say, well, I don't believe my character would do that. And so I tell them, well, then create a character that would.
Right.
Because that's what we're doing. This is at least part of the game. And so I think it's just important to talk to your players, know what kind of game you're playing and stuff. Well, Owen, this has been fascinating. Where can people find you online? Where can they learn more about you and learn more about your products and books?
So I've got my own blog, which is owenkcstephens.com. And I try and post there 5 times a week. I can be found on Facebook, which is facebook.com/OwenK.C.Stephens. I am also on Twitter, which is twitter.com/Owen_Stephens. And Rogue Genius Games, my company, has its own website, roguegeniusgames.com, although I am going to admit we have been busy and haven't updated it recently. So all those other things I mentioned are probably your best bet. Honestly, if you use both my initials, K and C, you can probably just do a Google search for Owen KC Stephens and find wherever I have posted something recently if everything else doesn't work for you or you don't remember it.
Okay, well, that's great. And I will provide links to all of those sites that you mentioned in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So my guest today has been Owen KC Stephens. Owen, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Okay, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed today's interview with Owen. It was just an absolute pleasure to speak with him. As I mentioned, I have provided links in the show notes to many of Owen's games as well as his RPG company. So you can check all of those out and learn more about him there. Now, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You will get 10 free dungeon maps, and you will never miss an episode of this show. Also, guys, if you would like me to keep making these episodes of the dicegeeks.com tabletop RPG show, please head over to patreon.com/dicegeeks and consider supporting the show. I thank you so much for listening today, and until next time, keep gaming.